We talk a lot about what I like to call the shuns on Pushback Talks. Sound unfamiliar? I'm talking about things like migration, touristification, gentrification, and financialization. These subjects, and how they're handled by governments, have an immense impact on housing around the world. Today, Fredrik and Leilani get together to talk about something right at the intersection of all four. Digital nomads have been around for well over a decade, and although the lifestyle had been growing in popularity for years, the major shift in the nature of work created by the pandemic caused digital nomadism to skyrocket in popularity. Now, there are millions of them, with tens of millions more planning to make the transition to digital nomad within the next 2 to 3 years. Digital nomads aren't quite tourists, and they aren't quite migrants, which makes governing them and the impact they have on the communities they visit complicated. That might work with a small number of people, but with the continued rise in popularity of international remote work, governments will need to figure out what to do with all their short-term visitors. Joining us in this episode is author, anthropologist, and consultant Dave Cook. Dave has more than 8 years of continuous research data on the remote work experience and has studied the impacts of digital nomadism on financialization and gentrification. Dave, Leilani, and Fredrik take a closer look at who digital nomads are, why they chose this lifestyle, the impacts they have on the places they visit, and the implications of digital nomadism on international migration.
I'm Fredrik Gerten, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And Leilani, you are in Halifax in Nova Scotia.
This is correct.
And you just came from Puerto Rico, where you've been to a conference, and I can hear that your voice, it sounds like you've been drinking a lot of whiskey, or not.
Yeah, one wishes that this voice is related to good times and the high life in Puerto Rico. But unfortunately, it's probably more related to the flight home from Puerto Rico, where everyone around me was coughing. And so, lo and behold, I have laryngitis. So my apologies to all of our listeners. No dulcet sounds from me.
Yeah. So I can tell you, our dear audience, when Leilani is nodding, I will kind of, she agrees. But anyway, I would just like to say that Pushback Talks, we've been doing this for like 3 years now, and the pandemic forced us to get going. And we have an audience in 160 countries, and you're all welcome. And please tell your friends about the podcast, because for us, it's a very cool place where we can learn more, and we can use the knowledge we have and the experiences we have, and we can invite really cool people. And today, again, we are touching on something we've been close to many times since we made Push, but this is an episode about the digital nomads, and we have one of the world-leading experts with us today, David Cook. You're in London. Welcome to Pushback Talks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Are you a digital nomad yourself?
Oh, that's a really, really great question. I think when I started this research project, which was in 2015, I was certainly very curious about it. I just discovered the term digital nomad in 2015. And I went to a conference in Bangkok, which was supposedly about digital nomads. And they introduced me as a social scientist, saying I was doing research. And everybody came to me and they asked what a digital nomad is. So I went there trying to find out.
At the conference? About digital
at the
nomads,
conference. Yeah. And the people weren't really quite sure. And I think that kind of confusion about what a digital nomad is still kind of exists today. Over the course of the last 8, nearly 9 years doing the research, I have realised that it's probably not the lifestyle for me, but I do find it very, very fascinating. I'm quite a rooted person. I live in London and I do like to travel, but how much I travel does have limits. And I do end up missing home quite a lot. In my research, increasingly, I marvel at how people can live this kind of lifestyle. And some people do it very well, and some people struggle. And I guess we'll talk about that today.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think we should start and just to say, okay, so now we have an expert. What is a digital nomad? Is there something like that, you know?
Yeah. I think one of the problems and one of the issues we have about the definition of what is a digital nomad is we have all of these people and they're coming from different countries, and governments don't really know what a digital nomad is, and they don't know how to count them. And it's quite a subjective self-identification. You know, sometimes people decide that they want to be a digital nomad, and as I said at the conference, they're not completely sure themselves. And in 2015, the numbers of digital nomads was much lower. There were beginning to be articles in the media about this new emerging lifestyle. I started to do my research in Chiang Mai in northern Thailand, and there were digital nomads there, but they were much smaller in numbers than they are now. And since the pandemic, obviously people couldn't travel during the pandemic, but what it did do was legitimize conversations about remote work. And, you know, millions of people around the world started to experience remote work for the first time during the pandemic. And since the pandemic has subsided, I hate to say the pandemic is over, but since, you know, things have returned more back to normal, this idea of being able to work and travel and be wherever you want when you're working has become much more mainstream. So the numbers are increasing, and we can talk about numbers and how we count them a little bit more in detail later. But the time has come where we actually do really need a universal definition of what a digital nomad is, because if governments can't agree on what a digital nomad is, we can't count them, we can't look at impact. I was called into the UK Treasury last year to give an expert interview so that the lawmakers in the Treasury could understand how to tax digital nomads because they're moving across borders. And we were supposed to spend half an hour or an hour, and I ended up staying all afternoon because we got into a really detailed discussion about what the definition was. And it was clear that the UK government was confused. So, you know, if the UK government is confused and there isn't a single definition that goes across, you know, different governments, it makes things very, very complicated. And, you know, some of the difficult things that might arise from this lifestyle are difficult to, you know, sort of like look at and legislate against. Yeah. But anyway, last year I wrote a paper which came out in March 2023 to try and solve this question of what a digital nomad is. And the paper was called What is a Digital Nomad? And I work with an American company called MBO Partners that do the biggest survey of digital nomads, and it's primarily in the United States. And we worked together on what the sampling was. And the basic definition is somebody who travels while they work or works whilst traveling instead of just going and doing a business trip, because that's just business travel. And we also agreed that it has to be somebody that goes to at least 3 different locations within a year. And these locations are not their home. They're not a friend's or a family's home. They're actually traveling while they're working and they're experiencing new places.
I mean, Leilani and I have, over the years, we've been working together, trying to understand, or try to find better definitions for how to describe what's happening in society. I mean, when we started with Push, we met with Saskia Sasson, the amazing professor, who told us that it's not gentrification what is happening out there. It's actually something much deeper. We talked about touristification. We're talking about all these different... We've been talking about the golden passports. Like my last film, Breaking Social, is also about the golden passports. And then we have the digital nomads. It reminds me when we had the premiere of Breaking Social in Mexico a few years ago. We were asked by Washington Post, their Mexican the Spanish edition to write an op-ed about basically the digital nomads, because there was a big debate in Mexico. There was like an American girl, Becky Sherman, who posted on Twitter, and she said, "Do yourself a favor and remote work in Mexico. It's truly magical." And then the whole Mexico exploded in kind of hatred towards this naive girl because, hey, come on, your lifestyle is fucking up our country. And we actually, in some way in our op-ed, defended Becky Sherman because it's not about the individual people in that sense. But I think this is something we've been trying to, and when I'm out traveling, I'm, Leilani knows this better. I'm a total hipster. Even if I'm a bit too old, I always go to the best coffee shops, which means I always meet the digital nomads wherever I go. And it's people, nice people sitting, working with their computers. You can sometimes overhear their calls to different offices. They talk about art and commercials. It's like a lot of them are, creatives out there. So there is, for me, I've been like, I like these guys, but Leilani, you are a little bit more critical.
I certainly do not remember defending this young woman talking about remote work in Mexico. Absolutely not. I don't think I have too romantic a vision of it. I mean, I guess, I think it's nice for digital nomads. I've read a few articles now and prepped for this interview. And I mean, I think it's nice that there's this broader ideology of like a stateless world, no sovereign states, that the world is we're all just part of one big, huge place, or the idea of creating a new world. That's nice and everything. But, my question is, do all these places want the digital nomads? The digital nomads want the world. But does the world want the digital nomads? And I'm not sure that they do, having just come back from Puerto Rico, where entire communities are being displaced by short-term rentals. So in that way, I don't have a romantic view. I have a lot of questions, I guess. And one of them that I have for Dave is around taxation, because you said that you were talking to the UK government about, how do we define this in terms of how do we tax it, right? Because if you don't know how to define it, you can't tax it. And I'm interested in that because I'm interested to know if any of these new digital nomad visas that are emerging. I just read that Japan has one coming, or has decided on one. And are they trying to tax the digital nomad in some way themselves? So when the digital nomad arrives in the foreign jurisdiction, is there going to be some taxation benefit beyond through like Airbnb? Often there's a tax, but like, is there an income tax coming for digital nomads?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, when I was speaking to the UK government, what they wanted to know was if people were avoiding tax in the UK, even though they were working somewhere else. And here I'm going to jump in and I'm going to say that digital nomads aren't a homogenous group, that they're quite a broad church. So I actually came up with 5 different sub-definitions of digital nomads after the pandemic, because what the kind of people that Fredrik was bumping into, these creatives that he was talking about in on coffee shops, they were the stereotypical.
I love them.
Digital nomads before the pandemic, and they kind of like tended to be freelance designers or freelance coders. They had a skill. They obviously had people that wanted to buy their skills, and they were just using that freedom to travel from place to place. But since the pandemic, the numbers have increased. Before the pandemic, we also had a second category, which were people that were running their own businesses, so that they kind of like had teams. They were, maybe working with virtual assistants, sometimes from the Philippines. They were running e-commerce businesses, so they were having to deal with a wider network of people. They were a smaller group, but they were, I guess, the second significant category. But what we've got now, which I didn't see before the pandemic, was salaried digital nomads. And now we have this culture war happening at the moment, whereby back to office culture war is, sort of like being fought. Certainly the finance industry has tried to pull people back into the office, and some of the big tech companies have all very famously pulled people back into the office. But in my research, I have come across people that are trying to travel with salaries and under work contracts at the moment. And famously, just after the pandemic, Spotify, for example, launched a work from anywhere program. And I think what's interesting about salaried digital nomads is this is a drop in the ocean now, but I think that this is going to become the norm, because the cat is out of the bag now in terms of remote work, and people now have the understanding and the imagination that it's something that will become available to them in future. So I think that's an interesting category. There are two more.
It's hard to wind it back, because a lot of universities and bigger offices are downsizing their buildings, so they can't even house all their workers anymore. So
and not just that, the expense of housing, right? So, right, you have a fancy job with a Bay Area company like Facebook or Stockholm Spotify, and people can't afford to live in those areas, but they want that job. So the attractiveness of trying to find a cheaper place to work and live, or cheaper places to live, and still do this kind of work. Maybe that's part of this. I don't know.
Well, it's become part of the cultural imagination, and I'll just finish the last two categories. So we've got experimental digital nomads, who are people trying out the lifestyle, and actually traveling and working is quite hard. And I find that quite a lot of these people drop off the scene. They find it a little bit too hard, but they're actually probably the biggest group. So when I'm doing research in Chiang Mai, I get all of these kind of like bright-eyed young neophyte digital nomads wanting to experiment with the lifestyle, and sometimes they just end up going quiet on social media. And I think finally, the final definition is something called an armchair digital nomad, which is something that MBO Partners came up with. And they did a survey in America where they estimated that at the end of 2002, there were 72 million people that were considering experimenting with the lifestyle in the next 2 to 3 years. And that this shows that there's massive potential growth in this area. I think the numbers are still quite small, but I think a lot of this conversation is going to be rooted in what happens. Somebody else, a guy called Peter Levels, predicted there will be 1 billion digital nomads by 2030. So I think the numbers might not be absolutely massive now, and it might not be having the same amount of impact as tourism, but this is going to sort of blend into the same kind of conversations that we've been having about over-tourism. Yeah. And I just want to make one other point now that I've just come up with those communicated those 5 categories. I think one of the really, really interesting things that we need to talk about is geo-arbitrage. So geo-arbitrage is the idea of taking a Western wage, travelling to a lower cost of living country, and have that wage enable yourself to have a richer lifestyle. And this is one of the things that's driving a lot of these mobilities, for want of a better word. And what's really, really interesting is not all digital nomads are rich. Some are on quite limited salaries. And quite a lot of the younger digital nomads that I meet are being displaced by gentrification in their own home countries. They can't afford to live in the Bay Area and San Francisco, so they go to Chiang Mai, or they go to Lisbon, or they go to Bali. They might be trying to create a minimum viable product for a, new business idea. And in their own words, they say, I'm going to these low cost of living places so that my runway, which is the amount of money and time they got set aside to develop these new business idea, lasts for longer, because if they're doing it in San Francisco, they're probably having to do 2 or 3 restaurant jobs as well. So we're exporting gentrification and creating gentrification in new places, which that makes it a very, very difficult, nuanced conversation, so that I don't know the background of the story of the woman that made the tweet in Mexico City, but it would be interesting to know her backstory, whether she was struggling before she moved. And I mean, that's the context, and it is quite confusing.
I think this is super interesting because this is touching everything we've been working on for such a long time. And I mean, I'm totally on the side of the people who want to go. I mean, many of the values some of the digital nomads have is like they want to be in a place where they can walk and they can bike. They don't want to commute in cars. I mean, they have, in many ways, good values. And when I go to many of these cities, I can also see that in some way they're also supporting the local business. They are supporting local coffee shops and restaurants and local shops. So in some way, they're also pouring money into the communities in some way. But then, of course,
I'm challenging you on that.
No, hang on. I'm going to take the next step. No, it's fine. Okay. I knew, Leilani, that my job here is to love these guys. And I open with that. No worries. But you can also see in many cities we have the WeWork, all the big money pouring in, trying to be a part of this. And that's not at all small-scale business. That's like financialization, big time again. So you can see the different scales. But I can sympathize with the people who want to stop commuting or who can't afford to live in San Francisco and so on. Leilani, no, it's your...
I absolutely sympathize. And I thought what Dave said was really bang on about the exporting of gentrification or financialization, even to use the language that I tend to use. I think it's a super interesting concept, and that Western nations and their corporations need to start considering this, because it's not as benign as you say, Fredrik. I mean, when you talk, and you've talked to our friends in Mexico, and when I talked to the people in Puerto Rico very recently, they say, like, it's eroding our language and our culture. I walk out of my home and I no longer hear Spanish. I'm hearing English, because so many of the nomads are English speakers or certainly not Spanish speakers. And I mean, the whole loveliness of going abroad gets lost as gentrification starts. And then we're getting this. I read a really interesting, or it was a podcast that my colleague put me onto about how cafes are becoming the same everywhere in the world. They look the same. They have the same plants. They have the same configuration of tables, and they're done by algorithm, basically. What do people want a cafe to look like? And so now we travel to Mexico for a cheaper life because we're not being paid enough to live in the societies where the jobs are. And then we're speaking our language, which is English and not the language of origin. And we're going to cafes that look like the cafes anywhere around the world. And there's something really, I don't know, depressing to me about that. I find this whole area that you're working in so fascinating, and it so totally dovetails with financialization. And I think you're writing about financialization in Chiang Mai. Did I read that somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer to this is I've been pulled into... this whole debate about gentrification. I mean, as an anthropologist, I was, I found this an interesting new subculture, right. And I wanted to kind of like chronicle it. And I'm not for or against digital nomads. Right. So I say, if I see something positive, I'll say something. And if I see something that's slightly dystopian, I'll raise that issue as well. And, there is a narrative which is digital nomads are ruining everything. That's particularly prevalent in places like Lisbon, and we can talk about Lisbon as an example. And I've been on TV shows and on talks like this with housing activists in Lisbon, and they don't put all of the blame at digital nomads, but they apportion part of the blame. Yeah. Because they're able to sort of like move and sort of like colonize some of these neighborhoods. The tourism came first, of course, but digital nomads are part of this conversation. And I've written a couple of articles on gentrification that's been happening in Lisbon. And when those were published, I got very criticised by the digital nomad community for not saying that it's all perfect. And I think one of the things that we can say, it is quite a utopian movement. So it is very positive, it is very utopian. And once we get to talk about gentrification, I think when we get to the heart of the issue, gentrification from the point of view of an outsider is seen as a positive thing because they see the effects of a gentrified place and they say it was better than it was before. But this completely ignores conversations about what happened to the people that were living there during the process of gentrification. And I think that a lot of digital nomads are simply not entering into those discussions.
I think Lisbon is a very interesting example. Because, I mean, you know that you went there as a UN Special Rapporteur, Leilani, looking into the golden passport incentives. And we know that the flood of money, the investment to get a passport in Lisbon went 95% to real estate, which then totally destroyed the housing situation because most of these new owners turned these homes into short-term rentals, and the touristification is a part of that. And of course, then the Portuguese government also put up a digital nomad incentive, and it's still running, what I understand. So you can move to Portugal by saying, I want to work as a digital nomad. But it's scary to see the effect on Lisbon and Porto. I mean,
I just want to jump in and use Lisbon as a little bit of a case study. My main research isn't there, but I have become involved in discussions and drawn into the debate that digital nomads are ruining everything. If we kind of unpack Lisbon, let's just kind of talk about the city and the scale. So it's a capital city and it's got a global profile, but it's only really got a metro population of about 500,000. So it's actually a very small city if we kind of look at global cities. So over-tourism was the first thing that really impacted the centre and all of the famous barrios and neighbourhoods in Lisbon, which are now out of reach. If we look at Portugal, the average salary is around 20,000 euros, and the rental prices of accommodation in the centre of Lisbon are simply out of reach. So that whole process of over-tourism has already occurred. And you were talking about golden passports. If we're talking about golden passports, I think we need to exclude digital nomads from those conversations. It's a different category. So those are kind of those are like digital expats that are coming in. One of the whole raison d'etre of digital nomads is that they're trying to sort of get out of the kind of traditional, I want to buy a house and settle. They talk about things like the subscription economy. I think what's happening with digital nomads in Lisbon is they're going to the next neighbourhoods that haven't been completely gentrified and put out of the price range of locals due to tourism, but then they're going to the next neighbourhoods out and having impacts there. And co-working spaces are springing up in these neighbourhoods that used to be very local neighbourhoods. And as Leilani was saying, nobody's speaking English and, coffee shops are springing up. So there's this kind of ripple effect that is happening. And housing is at, a crisis level in Lisbon because of the expats that are moving in. There's such an influx of people coming, especially from America, for various reasons. One, because their money goes much further. There are a lot of people leaving America because of the polarization that's happening there as well. And tourism is ever increasing in Lisbon. Digital nomads are kind of relatively new to that conversation. And I think a lot of digital nomad activists, and there are digital nomad activists, feel that they're too small in numbers and they're a drop in the ocean. One of the things that I'm saying is they are absolutely now part of the conversation, but they're not the root of all of the blame. But it's, it is really, really interesting to, if you kind of like think that somebody is going to come from America because they can't live in an American city, and they come to Lisbon, even if they're living in a suburb that's quite away from the centre, they're going to have an impact on local house prices.
Right.
Can I turn one question to you, Leilani?
Sure.
Because I will let you speak. No, but if we take my attitude that I love these young people who go out and meet the world, they are like supporting local neighborhoods, they are biking, they are walking. I mean, in some way they're good people and they're curious about other countries, other cultures. But couldn't we then blame the countries who invite them for not protecting their own citizens? Couldn't 100%. You have like a combination of you're welcome, but you will understand that we are protecting our own citizens with safeguard of their homes and in long-term contracts and so on. Wouldn't that be a possibility?
Absolutely. And I will say that I'm not against the general concept of a digital nomad. I think what Dave said was so bang on about the ideology they have of not home ownership and a more subscription-based lifestyle, although I think should they choose to have children, et cetera, that will become it becomes more interesting whether you can actually have that lifestyle, because the whole world isn't structured for that. That's the world's problem, not the digital nomad's problem, but that's just not how our world is structured. And 100%, Fredrik, I think what's of interest to me is I actually do believe in nation states. I do, in sovereign states. And I really liked what someone said, in an article I read about all of this. And maybe it was you, Dave, but I don't know. Is mobility a human right? So there's this notion of mobility as a human right. And then there's the notion of politics needing place. And I really love those distinctions, because I do think politics are about place often, and being engaged in your world is really about place in so many ways. So what I'm interested in is, what are states and governments, all levels of government, doing around this whole issue? And one of the things we know, Fredrik, they're not doing is protecting local residents. Mm-hmm. I mean, in Latin America, we saw Mexico City, Buenos Aires. I'm not sure where else, but it's becoming very common now for cities to welcome in Airbnb, to sign new Airbnb agreements. And and they're using digital nomads as the reason to strike these agreements. And I don't put that on digital nomads. I don't even put it on Airbnb. I put it on governments who are supposed to lead, and they're supposed to protect the human rights of their citizenry, and they're supposed to ensure adequate, affordable, long-term housing for those who are most vulnerable, and they're not doing that. So yes, I agree with you. This is on states. And Dave, please jump in.
Yeah, I want to come in and actually just like introduce an example so that we can sort of like have something concrete around some of the stuff that Leilani was saying. Because if we look at Lisbon, for example, it's in crisis. It's experiencing over-tourism. They want to reduce the amount of people coming in, particularly in the rental sector, so that it can become more livable and mothers and babies aren't being evicted, because that's what's happening in Lisbon. In Chiang Mai, where I've been conducting my research, Chiang Mai is a very touristic city. It's a slightly bigger city, and it's called sometimes the digital nomad capital of the world. So there are quite a lot of digital nomads coming and staying for a number of weeks or months, and they're either getting Airbnbs, and if they're staying longer, they might get some short-term rentals, that go over a couple of months. Now, Chiang Mai is slightly different at the moment because it's suffering from under-tourism, or it was, because of the pandemic. So they're kind of like saying, we want people to come, we want tourists, we want digital nomads. That is what's happening now. But I've been doing my research there for the last nearly 9 years, and I've been staying in a lot of different types of accommodation. And when I go for shorter visits, I do stay in Airbnbs. when I'm working at the university and, when I'm there for doing research. And there's something really disturbing happening in Chiang Mai. So there are these condo buildings that are being built all over the city. And when you go and stay there, they have these signs in the lobby that said, these are not short-term rentals. These are for local people. They're not for tourists. They're not for digital nomads. They're, it's against the law. But then you have these, hundreds and hundreds of key boxes on a wall. And you can see people coming in and out in wheelie suitcases all day. And when I first saw this, I was like, well, this is really, really weird. And I started to speak to the other residents. And the very few residents that were in there were saying it's an absolute nightmare to live here. But they also said it is really weird that these condo blocks are built and zoned as residential properties, but they have receptions and they've got a tourist shop downstairs. There's something going on with the planning and the zoning and, are these de facto hotels, and was that always the intention? And was there some loophole in local planning that's been happening? On one occasion, I stayed in this condo block, and I thought I was staying in someone's apartment, but it was being run by one of these bigger organisations that were renting out lots of different condos in the block, and they were all branded. It was called Home Tell or something like that. And I confronted them over Airbnb and said, really, should I be staying here? I don't feel quite right staying here, because it's saying that people like me coming on short-term visits, there's a big sign in the lobby saying that this is illegal. And they were saying, oh, it doesn't really matter. Don't worry about it. And I was kind of like saying, yeah, but I feel, really bad, as if I'm breaking a local law. I even contacted the tourist police and I heard nothing back. In the end, I did get to speak to the owner, who was a Swiss woman from Europe. And I said, you're doing this with this apartment. How do you feel about this? And she said, well, they just told me not to worry about it when I bought the apartment. And I said, but you're technically breaking local laws. And she said, well, money talks.
Wow.
And that's a good conclusion.
That's a great story.
That's a good conclusion. And to answer to your question about if this was built in the intention to make it a hotel.
Well, it had a swimming pool on the roof. It had a reception.
For sure, it was built like that. Yeah.
Wow. So, I know some condo blocks for high net worth individuals have all of those things and concierges, but there was just so many of them in Chiang Mai, and I just can't see how that is targeted towards local Thai workers.
And we see that all over the world. And I've been staying in something like that in Kuala Lumpur and in many other places where I land when I show my films and so on. And it is extremely soulless, and it's not supporting the local culture in any way. And of course, it's not accessible for locals at all. I have, if I'm allowed, I would like to bring in another element, because we are talking about, in our time in history, we are talking about refugees, immigrants, like that's the worst thing you can be on the planet, an immigrant or a refugee. All the borders are closing up everywhere. And then at the same time, we talk about golden passports and we talk about digital nomads. So it's like two positives and two extremely negatives. And in some way that tells me that it's like we're talking about human rights. Human rights are good when it's on white people and not as good if it's on black people or Muslims or whatever. So it seems like the digital nomads are closer to the golden passports than the refugees or the immigrants. Even if, I guess, historically, many immigrants were coming into cities and building new communities. And over history, immigration has been also something that has pushed development in many places around the world. And technically, I think also the digital nomads could be a part of that. But it seems like they are landing on this kind of more white privileged side. And I guess your numbers will prove the same also, Dave.
Yeah, so it's really, really interesting because I want to bring in the concept of strong passport. So most of the people traveling as digital nomads are traveling on strong passports. Now, we've got all of this discussion about digital nomad visas, but we are in very early stages. And the first thing I'll say about that is you can't have a digital nomad visa unless you have an international definition for what a digital nomad is. And I think that's where we need to bring people like the UN in to have a definition of what a digital nomad is. Because people, as an anthropologist, ask me how this differs from migration, and I can't answer that question. And I'm going to Lisbon to talk at a conference about whether this is a form of migration or not. And I want to open up conversations about this. But just to give you another very specific example, I was involved in another documentary called Romas that came out before the pandemic, and it was about digital nomads. And one of the participants in the documentary, or one of the characters, was this African woman from Kenya called Agnes. And she'd been living in the United States, and she was seduced by this digital nomad way of living, and she was doing first responder training, and she could do that remotely. So she was traveling around in South and Central America until one time she tried to get back into America. She flew into Miami and she got detained and then deported back to Kenya. And, she's become one of my research participants, one of my interlocutors over the years, and she's given me permission to tell her story. Now she's back in Kenya, and since the pandemic, they're just not allowing African nationals who aren't on strong passports to travel and have the privilege to experience this lifestyle. She's still doing first responder training to clients back in the US, so she's got that kind of like higher wage, but she's physically not able to travel. So she told me that, and this was back in 2022, that she tried to get an appointment at the US Embassy, and they said that there was nothing until 2024, 2025. So structurally, it's impossible. And this idea, which was started with Diogenes, the Greek philosopher, that we're all citizens of the world, is not available as a human right to all. And I'm always raising this as an issue. And I think that we need to ask really, really searching questions about, what this really is. The other thing that I will say is when we talk about a strong passport, it means whether you can travel visa-free to a country. And most of the digital nomads before the pandemic were traveling on tourist visas. They weren't traveling on digital nomad visas because they didn't exist yet. And I think what's really, really interesting is the first so-called digital nomad visa was launched by Barbados, and that country was suffering from under-tourism, so they were just looking at ways of, getting more people to come in the middle of the pandemic. But what's interesting, and then quite a few other Caribbean nation island states launched them, but these are places that have tax avoidance schemes, and they have a history of attracting high net worth individuals. So, is this about being a digital nomad, or is it about these pre-existing kind of global inequalities and tax avoidance and under-tourism? So, again, it's quite complicated.
Super interesting, though. I mean, the race dimension, and Fredrik, I loved how you framed it too, and at the end as well, Dave, like this idea of, who counts, who doesn't count, who gets to do what they want, who doesn't get to do what they want, right? And I mean, we're seeing it exposed globally right now, so much the divide between the North and South as the war on Gaza continues to rage. The world is being divided up very clearly about who counts and who doesn't. And I found it quite fascinating researching for the podcast that this race element was at play. And the story you told of the Kenyan woman, I did read about that, and really remarkable. And she said now she's really limiting her travel to within Africa, right? And her digital nomadness to within Africa. And I am with you that this is something that needs to be looked into more deeply. And this idea of, because race doesn't matter where wealth is greater than race, if you know what I mean. So You may be from a southern country, but you're a billionaire or a multi-millionaire, and you can avail yourself of a golden visa, for example, very easily. And so where race becomes blind, where we're blind to race because of money, it's all very interesting. I think I encourage you to continue down this path, Dave, because it's super important.
Yeah. I mean, there are digital nomads that are talking about this, sort of like global travel as a human right, or being a citizen of the world as being a global right. But really, in order for that to happen, we need to have really blunt conversations about the racism that is embedded in global passport and visa systems. And that's where the conversation needs to start. And I don't think the conversation is starting there. People are just kind of like saying that this should be a human right. You can't start to have those conversations unless we tell the stories of people like Agnes. And some of those people are absolutely, they're extraordinary, and they're having to try so much harder than somebody from the global north would. And it's heartbreaking, really.
Yeah.
And these are the kind of desires. I mean, migration is a practice of the imagination, if you look at it from an anthropological point of view. And it's our human right to have an imagination for a better life. When people talk about economic migration as if that's a bad thing, it's, how can we separate these conversations?
Impossible.
I have friends who are anthropologists who, were doing research in the Calais jungle, and all of the migrants that were trying to get across the British Channel. And initially, I kind of thought, well, the research that I'm doing isn't part of that conversation, but it absolutely is part of that conversation, because we just need to be talking about all human mobility, and we need equality in these conversations.
So this is super interesting, and even if I'm the romantic and Leilani is like the hard hitting, I think we can agree about a lot of things. I'm still thinking about when I was out with Push and people came to me and said, "Hey, come on, I'm a gentrifier. What shall I do? I can afford a little bit more rent in Los Feliz, LA, so I'm kind of in some way pushing out the Mexican families who lived in Los Feliz before." And I tried to tell them, come on, relax. It's not you, it's the system, it's financialization, it's a lack of protection. But so if we now have listeners who are digital nomads, I hope we have, how should we comfort them? Is there a way to behave as a digital nomad so you're not a part of the problem, so you are more a part of the solution? Do you have any ideas, David or Leilani? Or are you just killing them off like you're doing with everybody?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting in the middle of this, conversation. I'm trying to be neutral. I don't know how neutral I actually really sound. But one of the things that we've seen with digital nomads is the use of the term digital slow mad. So, in the beginning, people were traveling mainly on tourist visas, and they were having to leave countries within a month because, a visa on arrival, in Thailand at the time, was a month, and so people were having to move. A lot of people have changed their strategies and tried to target countries where they can stay for longer, say for 3 months. And sometimes if people do become more attached to a place, sometimes people do apply for, different types of visas or, temporary residence visas. And, sometimes they do pay tax. I mean, the advice that I would give to digital nomads is, for your own mental health as much as everything else, understand how quickly you can travel and change countries, because I have seen quite a lot of burnout with some people that are traveling too much. And be honest with yourself about, how much you think you're going to integrate with local culture, because you might have the desire to sort of integrate with the local culture, but even if you're going to leave in 3 months, to a local person, they still feel that they're going to be left in some kind of way. And I think it's really important that digital nomads understand that if we're going to say they're mobile or nomadic, they are going to leave. Some digital nomads talk about dating locations, you know, and maybe kind of like going back to them. But it kind of just shows that these places are not places where they're setting down roots, but they're backdrops to places and where they're working. And so I just ask people to just think around the really difficult, you know, nuances that come, you know, with this constant mobility. And it's, you know, it's really interesting that a lot of digital nomads on my study end up going to co-working spaces after saying that they were rejecting the office. So they travel around the world, thousands of miles, and they go to something which is essentially a serviced office. So, yeah, I'm kind of encouraging people to engage with some of the ironies that are happening here. I'm not saying that it's their fault, but it is really, really interesting. And a lot of the people on my study, because I've been doing it over a number of years, do give up. And then you see on Facebook that they've said, hey, I've actually bought a place and it's really, really great to be rooted. So these are processes that evolve and change over time.
Yeah.
Leilani, do you have any comfort, or you will just keep kicking?
I think there's what David just said is right, that if we are all just a little more self-conscious of what we're doing and what it means for us with our privilege to travel to some other place and be there temporarily, that in and of itself is a step forward, I think. When I was in Puerto Rico, I had a really interesting experience where I was taking a few days vacation before my work set in. I was there to give a keynote speech about Airbnb and human rights and the right to housing. But before then I took a few days vacation with my partner, and we went to these two very cool restaurants on 2 consecutive evenings. And then while I was there for my work, I was given a tour of areas where Airbnb is really penetrating, or short-term platforms, and neighborhoods are being gentrified and financialized. And of course, the 2 restaurants I went to were in these neighborhoods. And so I had a moment of, wow, right? I mean, just to reflect on that, the fact that I was drawn to 2, you know, hipster, nomad-y type restaurants, just gave me more pause for thought about my own interactions, even though I was there, you know, ostensibly promoting human rights and trying to get the local government to be more mindful about Airbnb. So I think there is something there. It changed my entire feeling about those first few days in Puerto Rico. And I certainly would return to Puerto Rico and, you know, being way more conscious. I think that's important. You make different decisions.
My advice to people would be to try to understand where they have landed, and also to connect with people who are struggling, you know, because there are, like in Mexico, there are a lot of engaged, also in Lisbon, there are a lot of engaged people who want something. And then you have to find out how you can support that or not work against it, because you don't want to be on the wrong side. And of course, digital nomads are not people who with criminal money buy golden passports. And of course, you're not the same kind of crooks in that sense. At the same as we as tourists go to a place, you know, the touristification is also, with all our consuming powers, we are changing the concept of many cities. It's tough, but my point here is that to feel guilt is kind of a useless feeling, you know. It's better to try to be solidarian or curious or, you know, something else. But guilt is like, it's such a waste of time and energy.
Yeah, one of the positive conversations that's coming out of this, there are some digital nomads that are ideologically opposed to the nation state. And I know Leilani is kind of like putting herself on the other side of that argument. And as an anthropologist, I find the tension between rejecting the nation state and, you know, and embracing it really, really fascinating. I mean, during the pandemic, more than half of the digital nomads on my study went home and they accessed the welfare state. So, you know, on the one hand, they're saying, I'm a citizen of the world, but they're still engaging in the social contract, which I, you know, very firmly believe in. But one of the interesting things that some of the people that are ideologically saying the nation state isn't fit for purpose anymore are saying that maybe things should all be organised on a city level more. People are talking about the 15-minute city. Some digital nomads are actually talking about cities taxing digital nomads, so that they can access services. So, those are kind of interesting conversations that are arising. And that links back really to Diogenes when he said, I want to be a citizen of the world. Ancient Greek was a selection of city-states. So I think there are interesting conversations about, the nation state versus the city that are happening with digital nomads. I don't know when the final solutions are, but I think, those are interesting conversations that are occurring.
There are probably no final solutions. This is an ongoing process, but I think to be able to impact our time, we need to talk about it and we need to understand it. So I'm really happy to spend time with you, Dave, and you, Leilani, to better understand what's cooking on our planet. And so I wish you a good day in Halifax, Leilani, to give your keynote speech, and Dave, keep on working. And I'm going to South Africa in a few hours. So.
Oh, nice. So, and I'm not doing any speeches in Halifax. No. This is all the talking I'm doing in Halifax. It's over.
It's over. Thank you very much for being on Pushback Talks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dave. Really nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To support the podcast, become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Follow us on social media at make_the_shift and push_the_film. Or check out our websites, maketheshift.org, pushthefilm.com, or breakingsocialfilm.com.